Hi everybody, thank you for coming along today to this talk. So I'm Sam Matthews and joining me today is Dr. Louise Anderson, and we'll be introducing you to the new spatial tool and updated evidence base for the Universal Asset Service Matrix. So to provide a little bit of context on what the UASM or Universal Asset Service Matrix is, it was first launched way back in 2023 at one of SMMR's conferences in Bristol. And it was created as part of a collaboration with the Marine Biological Association, which has now been hosted on their website called Marlin, as part of the MNCA program. For those who are not familiar, the MNCA program stands for Marine Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Program, and it's a 3-year DEFRA-funded program that was looking into identifying areas to integrate natural capital into management and decision making. Cool. So just in case you're not too familiar what an asset service matrix is, I'll do a quick intro before going into all of this information about the UASM. So an asset service matrix describes and catalogues linkages between natural assets, like habitats or species, and the ecosystem services they provide, for example, cultural services like tourism or provisioning, regulation and maintenance services like carbon sequestration, for example. So an asset service matrix essentially stores this information and these linkages and puts it into a visual summary. So here is a nice example of a classic ASM that you'd find within the literature. This one in particular focuses on a project in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and on the left-hand side you have your assets, which in this case are your habitats. So you have everything from coral and algae to seagrass and sand. And then on the top, you have your ecosystem services. Like previously mentioned, you have your cultural from tourism and snorkeling, as well as your supporting services in terms of carbon uptake and carbon sequestration. In the center of a table, you have these colored boxes, and these denote your ecosystem service delivery. So you have a green box for high ecosystem service delivery and a red box to denote low ecosystem service delivery. The confidence of that ecosystem to asset linkage is then given a numbered system. So high confidence is given a number of 3, with low confidence given a number of 1. So what makes the Universal Asset Service Matrix universal? So essentially, within the literature, there are plenty of ASMs present, but they are often very dedicated to their specific task within the literature and are very difficult to compare between the two because of differences in standardization. So this is where the UASM comes in, as essentially tries to standardize this information so we can get all the information from these ASMs within the literature and combine together. And we've done this through many different ways, mostly through standardization of our assets and surfaces. So for example, our habitat assets have been standardized using commonly used habitat classification codes like UNIS and JNCC habitat codes. These are commonly used across the UK and Europe, and our base code on the system is UNIS 2007. We've standardized our species using a unique identifier known as API IDs. These essentially allow us to unique direct a specific species and allows for updates in any of the scientific names if there's a classification change or multiple common names, so there's no duplications within a database for a specific species. Our ecosystem services have also been standardized using a classification system known as CICES, which stands for Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services. And the main reason why we chose this system over other classification systems, as it follows a very similar hierarchy to our habitat codes like UNIS. So for example, UNIS has broad scale habitats at levels 3 and 4, whereas our CICES codes have broad scale ecosystem service classifications at levels 1 and 2. Our ecosystem service supply scores have also been standardized into either high, medium, low, negligible, or data deficient. And our confidence scores have been converted in 2 ways, either inherited directly from the source literature if they already have confidence scores available, and this is converted into a high, medium, and low format, or if there is no confidence available within the source literature, we then rate the confidence based on the type of literature it's coming from. So for example, if you're looking at peer-reviewed literature, that's given a score of high confidence, and expert opinions are given a score of low confidence. So what updates have there been in the ESM since it was launched in 2023? So the big update, which I'll be talking about today, is the new spatial visualization tool, which is now available on the Marlin website. And this essentially allows you to better visualize habitat assets across the UK and the potential ecosystem services they provide. We've updated our CICES classification to 5.2. We've improved the user interface online, as well as had a big major evidence update, increasing the size of the database by 182%. So without further ado, this is what the spatial tool looks like on Marlin's website. And so the main reasoning for creating this new spatial tool on top of the original USM is to allow users to better visualize where the habitats assets are in the UK and work out what ecosystem services may provide. And it just allows more users and use cases for anyone wanting to provide it, to apply it to any projects they may have. And essentially what it entails at the moment is a nice map of the UK followed by a filter box where you can filter your habitat assets, as well as a place to filter your ecosystem services by their different supply level scores or confidence levels. So in terms of the base map for the new spatial tool, we've used the UKC map. This is a map that falls under a suite of products that JNCC create. And this includes everything from the UKC map, EUC map, and combined map, and these are all predictive and composite mapping products. The UKC map itself is a predictive map and has detail down to the broad scale habitat levels of levels 3 and 4 for UNIS, and has complete full UK coverage. And the main reason why we chose the UKC map over the other two at the moment is because it's the most up-to-date map with its it was updated in early 2025. So if you look on the right-hand side, you have a nice example of how you can apply the UKC map to map potential ecosystem services across the UK. And in this example, we have data from the Universal Asset Service Matrix showing potential average cultural ecosystem services across the UK. Cool. So in terms of using the USM spatial tool, we recommend you approach using the tool in two main ways. Either searching for a specific habitat across the UK, or using the tool to look at a specific region in UK to work out what assets are present there and the potential ecosystem services they provide. So here is an example of how you can search for specific habitats. So for this, all you have to do is enter your habitat type and the habitat access box below the map and click search, and it will generate results to show where exactly these assets can be found within the UK. If you scroll down, you'll then see this section here, which shows off all of the potential ecosystem services delivered by this habitat asset. And as the UKC map is at a broad scale habitat level of 3 and 4, we have also aggregated the ecosystem services to a more broad scale level for CICES level 2. And we've done this by aggregating all linkages within USM, whether they're 2 and then 3 and 4 up to these the level 2 broad scale area. And this is where the unique link section comes in this diagram. And this essentially shows how many linkages from the USM were used to generate these ecosystem service supply scores. Some of your eagle eyes may have noticed this warning in the first search term, where it says that there's over 30,000 records present in your search criteria, and it could only generate 30,000. So due to the size of a UKC map and to allow for efficient running of the tool, we've limited the maximum amount of polygons to be generated within the map to 30,000. This, however, can easily be worked around. So for example, if you do get this warning at a large UK scale, all you have to do is rerun your search, but then use the bounding box to reduce your search area. So for example, if this happens, I'd recommend researching at a specific country level. So either searching at Welsh level or English level or Scottish level. So the second way we expect users to want to use a spatial tool is looking at a specific region. And for this example here, we've decided to go for Plymouth, and particularly the Plymouth Marine Sound National Park. To draw this bounding box, we've used the tools on the left-hand side. And to get an idea of all of the potential assets present here, we've left the habitat assets filter section blank and have limited our ecosystem services section to generate results for either high, medium, and low for both ecosystem service supply and confidence. And once you're happy with these criteria, all you have to do is click run, and you get something that looks a bit like this. So essentially, all of these nice colored polygons are all your different types of habitat assets found within that bounding box. And to understand a little bit more about them, all you have to do is hover your mouse over them, and it'll tell you exactly what habitat type it is. You will have also noticed that it has generated polygons that also flow outside of a bounding box. This is because we've designed a bounding box essentially to pick up any polygon which falls into the bounding box in UKCMap and generate a whole polygon, rather than cutting it to fit into the limited polygon bounding box shape. And then once you scroll down again, you'll see all of the potential ecosystem services provided by these broad scale habitats in the bounding box. When the ASM is minimized, you'll see all of the habitat assets found within that bounding box, which you can see on your left-hand side. So you have everything from A3.1, higher infiltrable rock, down to A5.2, sublittoral sand and variable salinity. However, if you're looking at a specific area, you may be aware of specific biotopes that might be present in that region, or would like to know what potential ecosystem services are provided by those biotopes that fall under these broad-scale habitat codes. So to do this, all you have to do is click the include hierarchy sublevels in your search criteria. And instead of getting the results you get from the left, you'll get a more detailed results function as seen on the right. So for example, we have A4.1 high energy infiltrable rock present, and in the results you have A4.131 bryozoan turf and erect sponges on tide swept circumcylindrical rock. Cool. So once you're happy with the data and you want to download the data and interrogate it further, all you have to do is click the export function and you'll get a CSV file that looks a lot like this. So for the spatial tool, we've tried to keep it as simple as possible and have limited it to show your ecosystem services in your CITES codes and your habitat assets in your UNIS codes, as well as your service supply scores, your confidence scores, and the reference for each linkage. However, some users might want to have more detailed information and dig even further into the linkages within the USM database. And to do this, all you have to do is take your inputs from the spatial tool and then input it into original USM and export a sheet from there, and you'll get something which looks like this. So as you can see here, you still have your standardized ecosystem services from CITES and your UNIS codes for your assets, as well as equivalent JNCC habitat codes from 9706 and 2022. More importantly, however, we also have the original source ecosystem service information, which came direct from the literature, so you can get a better understanding on how exactly these have been converted to fit into the Universal Asset Service Matrix format. So alongside adding the spatial tool, we have also improved the user experience for the original USM. To do this, we had a stakeholder workshop in 2024, which located areas we can improve on the service. And sort of the big standout areas were to allow users to better visualize the data online. And one key area of doing this is to allow users to have an asset forward view of the asset service matrix online, or having a ecosystem service forward view using the CITES code, and you can switch in between the two. Secondly, we've also improved functions of being able to expand and contract the data on the online viewable tool, just so it's easier to interrogate it whilst online. We've also updated our classification codes for our ecosystem services from 5.1 to 5.2. And this essentially has two benefits. Firstly, it has allowed for greater simplicity and specificity in the data we can provide in the USM, and also it future-proofs the USM moving forward, as it has the most up-to-date classification system in its database. Ooh. And for the next section, I will move over to Louise. He'll introduce you to the updated evidence base.
All right, hi everybody. So for the second half of this presentation, I'm going to be talking through some of the updates that we've made to the underlying evidence base, as well as discussing some of the ways that the UASM has been applied in the last few years, and then go through some sort of user caveats and some key discussion points for you to understand as you're playing with the tool. Okay, so if you were at that first presentation back in Bristol a few years ago now, you'll know this already, but hopefully you can forgive me repeating myself. But the first iteration of the UASM was based on a literature review that was done in sort of late 2022, early 23. And when we were first building this tool, the user research that we ran at the time suggested that users would want to be able to add their own evidence to this tool and sort of update it as they go along and keep it current that way. Unfortunately, the reality is not quite panned out that way. People like the idea of being able to update their own evidence, but as it turns out, it doesn't realistically happen. So what that means is that the UASM was due a big evidence update, and as part of the MNCEA program this last year, we set aside some time and money to do that. So this was a collaboration with the Marine Biological Association again, and they started by running a gap analysis, the MBA. And this was to identify some priority habitats and ecosystem services that were of particular interest that didn't have a lot of evidence, and areas where there were sort of particularly few linkages in the UASM. Overall, they identified about 35 habitats across multiple UNIS levels and sort of areas where gaps could be filled. And this informed how they ran their literature review. So they identified, for example, deep sea habitats as a kind of key priority area to focus on. And from a species point of view, there were some fish species that they wanted to really bulk up as well. And this literature review, just the MBA's work, contributed like well over 6,000 new linkages. So it's a really significant update for the UASM. In addition to that, we were able to add some commercial fish species data provided by CFAS, as well as starting to gather some of the outputs that were happening across the MNCEA program and integrate those as well. So there's been a couple of chunks of new evidence that have been added and standardized, which is really cool. So what that means is there's basically been this enormous increase in the amount of evidence that's contained by the UASM, both for habitats and for species. And this is really useful. It solidifies the usefulness of the tool for you as users and hopefully ensures it's, at least for now, kept up to date. And that's something that we're going to take on as JNCC in the future, is try and keep that literature as up to date as we possibly can. If you are like on a separate screen right now, running away to go and play with the UASM, that's great. Just one thing to be aware of is we're still in the process of uploading these linkages. So if you're using it and downloading data at the moment, please remember to take note of the date of any of those downloads. We're expecting this final data upload to happen or be finalized in the next week or so, but things might change between now and then. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was how the UASM has been used. So I'm going to start broadly and then we'll go into some specific examples. But basically, the UASM is useful for providing this really nice broad overview of the available evidence for habitats, species, and ecosystem services of interest. Asset service matrices in general are typically used as kind of a quick summary or overview sort of tool as a way to get like a good overview of the information that's available relatively quickly. It's not super specific, but that's kind of been reflected in how this tool has been applied as well. So one of the things that's been used for is looking at regional case studies, narrowing down a geographic area of interest, and looking at the ecosystem services provided in a particular area has been really interesting. And that's been applied particularly for some of the MPAs that we're looking at the moment. As part of that, and the data that the UASM spits out, you can use to kind of map potential ecosystem service provision. And this in turn is really useful for then starting to think about perhaps marine spatial planning and decision making. Other things we've found useful over the last few years is that it's actually really handy as a communication tool. So using the UASM outputs provides the opportunity to highlight ecosystem services that may not be immediately obvious to stakeholders and decision makers that you're working with, So we've found it quite useful in that respect as well, just in terms of like starting up conversations about things that might otherwise have been overlooked. And finally, it's been used as a kind of starting point for people's literature reviews. So as a way to get like a quick overview of what the available evidence is, and then people can take it away and apply it to their own projects and narrow down as they need to. So it's been applied in a couple of different projects, and these are just like a quick snapshot. As things are published, we can absolutely share more detail, but it's been used in a couple of different ways since its launch, and for a few projects, the standardized structure has been mirrored to support future crossover and new applications as this field develops. So for example, there's the Litter Impacts on Marine Ecosystem Services project that DEFRA did. This was a review that sort of mirrors the structure of the UASM, so you can apply those bits of information as you're interested. And similarly, the Environment Agency has been developing freshwater and terrestrial versions that have kind of have been informed, that's the word I'm looking for. They've been informed by the way that we've kind of structured the standardized part of this asset service matrix. And finally, another thing that it's really handy for is intersecting with other evidence. So outputs from the UASM have been mapped together with indicator outputs. So the example I'm talking about is the extent of physical disturbance, or BH3 indicator. And this is quite useful to look at those intersecting sets of information and identify overlapping areas of high seabed disturbance and of high ecosystem service delivery, because that can be really helpful from kind of a prioritization and management perspective. Okay, a couple of things to be aware of if you are using the UASM, which I hope you are. So if the confidence isn't available in the source literature, we don't evaluate it. The UASM doesn't pass a judgment on how good a certain piece of evidence is. So we just provide like a reflection of the kind of resource. So peer-reviewed information is considered higher confidence than something that's not peer-reviewed. But as we all know, just because something is peer-reviewed doesn't necessarily mean it's any good. So basically, users are responsible for deciding how and why you want to use certain pieces of evidence. It's not practical for kind of our team at the JNCC to make those judgments, and it's also not appropriate because the criteria of what should and shouldn't be included will vary from project to project. So what that means is that as a user, it's up to you to really engage critically with the information that's coming out of the UASM and thinking about how you want to use it and why. All right, quick water break. So the other thing that's worth knowing is that the way the UASM is structured means that you can't necessarily tell the difference between a true gap. So that's something where a service is not provided by a given asset, and an evidence gap, where a service is provided by an asset, but there's not data in the UASM to construct that linkage. We've tried to address this as best we can with kind of the scale and breadth of the latest literature review, but those things will still exist, so that's something to be aware of. In terms of areas that we'd like to look at in the future, at the moment, the estimates of service supply are still categorical, so high, medium, low. And that's because quantitative evidence for ecosystem service delivery is firstly really variable and secondly limited for quite a lot of things. So this is something that might be fun to explore in the future, and also something that perhaps for individual projects which are much more focused, that might be something you'd be able to build onto the information that the UASM provides. In a kind of similar vein to this, an understanding of how asset condition affects ecosystem service delivery would be really interesting as an area to develop further. So the UASM assumes that service delivery is happening from a place of like the asset being in good condition. We know in reality that for lots and lots of habitats and species, that's just absolutely not going to be the case. So this is something that would be really interesting to explore in the future, and I'd be very happy to talk to people about that as well. Finally, the last thing. So because the UASM essentially just takes the available research and standardizes it, it's going to reflect sort of biases or gaps or kind of skews of focus that exist in the wider literature. So those things do exist, and they will just be reflected back through the UASM as well. So what we think is happening here is that there's potentially a skew towards asset service linkages where For example, ecosystem service provision is high and easy to measure, where research focus has perhaps shifted towards high value services or those with the highest material benefits. And again, we've addressed this as best we can with the evidence review and the gap analysis, but that's something that I do think as users you need to be aware of. All right, so finally, just as a reminder, you can find the UASM on the Marine Life Information Network website under the Ecosystem Services tab or at the following links. I'd really encourage you to go away, have a play with it, and if you have feedback or if you're having problems using the tool, please do let us know, because it's something that we're kind of continually working on and hoping to keep updated as much as possible. And thank you very much for listening. So please do get in touch if you have further questions. We've got plenty of time to talk about it now. And if you have feedback or you'd like to collaborate in the future, please just get in touch. You can contact the MNCEA program directly, or either Sam or I for UASM specific queries.